passage that I've quoted you, the first passage is the specific parts that I've bolded. Those are the ones that I'm curious about. So like the first one is the bolded one is it means that the virtue of talking about the virtue of pride and as moral ambitiousness. And then it says, it means that one must earn one's right to hold oneself as one's highest value by achieving one's own moral perfection. I think we did touch on this last conversation, but you can see my first question is like, isn't holding oneself as one's highest value just a constant choice being made rather than a value being earned? And I think we sort of mentioned like last session, well, maybe it's, well, I said this, maybe it's the subconscious accumulation of making those choices that gives you a feeling, and that's what's being talked about. But it's not so clear from that passage.
I mean, I think that's the beginning of working towards pride. You would begin with a general sense of what it means to be yourself, what it means to hold yourself as a value. But I think this is going even deeper to say you're like having a virtue of pride, like moral ambitiousness is more than just having that sense of what's maybe leaning towards an idea of life, but taking it more explicitly. This is more going from beyond that general sense of life you might have to spelling out what your ethics ought to be, the ethics of like reality, I guess, so what reality should dictate what you ought to do. This is just saying we ought to, these are making specific claims about morality that, I mean, it is true, you can hold your highest value as, rather than that is earned, you can just say I'm the most important, I don't care how I earned it or not. I mean, that could, you could do that. It's not saying that's impossible.
Sorry, I didn't. So sorry to stop you. I didn't get that last bit that you said. You could say something. I didn't.
Like you could, yes, any person could just claim, I value myself as the highest value, without regard whether I earned it or not. It's not saying you can't do that. You certainly can, but if you want to have an objective ethics, have an objective sense of what is good based on your needs of flourishing, your needs of survival, your nature as man, by following those, like your ambitiousness would imply that you are earning what you are, that you don't seek or gain by faking reality, lying about reality, or lying to yourself, or evading reality, that that you're seeking to earn and deserve these sort of things.
So you're saying in this context, what is meant by earn is having an explicit set of principles and ideas by which you then try and live by in order to that's what it would mean to hold yourself as your highest value. So for example, not accepting, she says, not accepting any code of irrational virtues impossible to practice, and by never practicing the virtues one knows to be rational. So is that what you think the earn part means in this context?
Yes. And keep in mind that the structure of the essay had been making a position that, well, what is the basis of ethics, which is a choice to life and all that, but that left open the question, how do you know what is good? What is good? And all those questions, like it gave out the idea of where to look, but not what the answer was. And here is taking a step further. This is the explicit morality you would have in your mind, that once you understand the question, like once you understand that the purpose of you as a living organism is to live, and living is flourishing, to accomplish that, you need to then have an explicit code of ethics, which is what Rand is trying to argue for, that not only should we have a sense of what's right or wrong, even like striving for life, but to then hold those principles explicitly through reason and all that. I mean, that's why she had been explaining about reason and judging things very carefully, and being honest with reality, then you have to make these things explicit, make explicit what may have been implicit. So maybe you might want to value yourself, but are you valuing that in terms of a subjective thing? Is because it felt right, or are you really seeking the value with everything it should mean, seeking your flourishing, not evading reality, all those aspects? So if you are honestly and truly, objectively holding yourself as the highest value, that you must earn it. And that would be pride if you earned it with that ambitiousness. Does that help you framing it?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking now, I just realized maybe what in this, so there's obviously someone who's acting for themselves, and in any other context, that like as in they're doing what's in their best perceived interest. And I would say that's an act of them holding themselves as their highest value. But in this context, I think what you're saying and what it's getting at based on what you've told me is that there's obviously a difference between motivation and consequence. So if you are to genuinely hold yourself as your own highest value, this goes back to what you're saying. There are certain principles which you must understand, and you must act a certain way. It's not as simple as I want this, therefore I'm going to do it, even though that's a motivated action. It's more than that. Is this genuinely something that's good for you? Are you thinking about it? Are you thinking the action through? Are you acting on unearned guilt, as an example that's in this passage? So is that, would you say that's a correct view of what she means by earned? Now, because I've suddenly made that distinction between two contexts, one of self-motivated action and one of self-motivated and moral action.
Yeah, I think that's the way of thinking of that earlier in the essay, she is acknowledging the different ways you can act, and she's making a claim about, well, life should be it, but yeah, this is more about going to the explicit level, like not just identifying that life is important, but really holding that explicitly, acknowledging what is required, and doing that in an ambitious way, which the way you framed it, I think is correct. That is the right way to think of it. And the consequences might not be the way to think of it, because in either case, you might be thinking of the consequences, but are you thinking it consistent with your needs of survival and your nature? Your nature? Are you operating by those standards? And if you are, that would be what objectivist ethics would require of you.
And yeah, again, just to clarify for myself, so the earning part is the part of thinking through those principles or thinking through things before acting. Is that what it is? So the self
part of it. But like notice at the end of the passage is by never placing any concern, wish, fear, or mood of the moment above the reality of one's self-esteem. I think that's trying to reflect that you're trying to take the reality of what you have done and the way you live life and your actions and behaviors, taking them honestly and truly, and recognizing if you are acting within morally, like seeking perfection and having the pride to want no less than the best. Like you want moral perfection, you don't want to evade reality in any sense. Not only just being satisfied with taking some good actions, but the ambitiousness to be always good. It's not an occasional thing. Like you're ambitious to the level like it matters a whole hell of a lot to be moral.
Yeah.
And then she does get into how being moral isn't condemning yourself to suffering or discomfort or making yourself go against your life. It actually creates happiness and joy and passion within your life to follow moral rules. It's not just like, oh, there's a set of rules you must follow, and that pride is just following the rules, but going beyond that, recognizing your needs as an individual entity, recognizing what you need and required for your existence, which would be moral perfection. So it's like the pinnacle of moral action.
So in this context, what would be someone who's, I'm just trying to think of a character who's not earned his moral perfection, but acting in a motivated way. So like, for example, someone who, let's say someone who's got a lot of issues with drug abuse or alcohol, but on this day, and maybe even going forward into the future, he's decided, wow, I really want to change. And, now I'm gonna go get help. Like, so you could say he's chosen, well, I don't know. I mean, like, how does that scenario fit into this specific context of earning the right to hold oneself is he not now holding himself as his highest value, this person?
That would be a tricky situation, I think, because you have to acknowledge that all the errors that they made in their life, that's their fault and damaging to what led them here is partly been their responsibility, and they should acknowledge their responsibility for that. They should not obey it, or they should not evade it, that they should acknowledge it and live up and realize that what had happened, and from there on out seeking that moral perfection. You could say that they've realized what moral perfection is and they've reformed themselves and now seek it without fail, that it really drives them. You might ask, like, well, are they still morally perfect, or to what extent should we take into their previous actions? That's really difficult to say. I think that's really in-depth and nuanced in how you would judge them. But as far as our discussion here, you would acknowledge that at least now they have the honesty to recognize what they've done, what they need to do to change, and all of that. It would be like not evading the nature of what has happened. Like if you acknowledge you have a drug addiction, there's certain implications to get over that for whatever person that might be. And the reason why it's a hard discussion is because there's always so many complexities of addiction. To what extent, once you've realized your addiction, to what extent are you responsible for different behaviors, or to what extent can you be expected to change? And that's the conflict of, but the overall idea, like, yes, they can become perfect. It's not a matter of totaling how many bad actions and good actions you've done in your life, but you are striving from here on out.
I suppose this also goes back to a previous question I had, which we discussed. You then brought up, we were talking about at what point is someone evil? Like there are a certain amount of evil actions or good actions. At what point do they become, how do you then categorize them in evil? And then you talked about at what point is a color a different color? And so the way this relates is at what point has this man earned the right to hold himself as his own highest value? Like, let's say he's taken one action. Has he earned the right to hold himself as his highest value, or is he beginning to earn himself the right to hold himself as his own value? And that's, I don't have an answer to that. And like you said, I think that's a complicated, I don't know. That's, maybe we can get into that later in epistemology.
Yeah, I mean, that is a hard question. I mean, you probably could argue about that forever, but yeah, because there's so much nuance involved there. Are you beginning it? Are you there? Those are very fine distinctions.
I'm sure there's a way to cut and clarify that
Yeah.
That question and make a lot of good distinctions, but I don't have the mental knowledge and skills to do that yet. But
I
maybe
think a related question is that you wrote down here. How can I validate that one minor bad choice will affect my self-esteem later? How can you validate that? I think that'd be more into a matter of like reasoning techniques than specifically. It could be about epistemology, or it could be about thinking techniques you might want to be asking about there. How can you accurately and properly judge choices? I mean, you could look at maybe previous experience with similar choices. That's one way to look at it, of course. Just have you been through something similar, and can you apply what had happened there to this situation? Or one minor bad choice. Validating would be hard because to some extent you might be wondering, well, you'd have to ask yourself, what do I know for certain and what can I not possibly know? Or you could ask, to what degree will it affect you? I mean, that can be a hard question too. So, I mean, the easiest way to go about that is just first think about all the virtues involved. If it might not take very long to think about, but that's one way to think about it through. Well, does it imply something dishonest? Does it imply something about being lazy? Does it imply something about putting someone above you as more important than yourself? Or any number of things? Or are you giving into the pleasure of the moment rather than really considering things? And only you can really know that, but it gets really complicated after that point.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you said earlier about looking back at previous choices, although the latter part that you've just mentioned now, I would say, is more guidance in making a moral choice rather than validating the impact of a choice.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And validating is that's more an epistemological thing, or at least methods of understanding what's true and what's not.
That's what I'm getting more and more interested in that, but that's, we can definitely go to that later.
Yeah, I mean, that it's good to highlight there that Rand does make a very strong connection between epistemology and ethics, and that's probably a very important thing to understanding her ethics, that she's just not trying to make claims out there just because they sound right or they are logically coherent within themselves, but she's trying to say, since reason is so fundamental, that her ethics are based on reason. It's not that she has her ethics and then goes backwards to then fill things in with epistemology, but that reason being so fundamental is anything about ethics can always be traced back to an epistemological question. How do you know what's right or wrong? And what allows us to know that fact? Everything really stems from there. It's good to start with the ethics, of course, because that gives you some material to work with, and why her epistemology matters. It's not just a philosophical exercise, but it leads us somewhere. That epistemology isn't, in a sense, our strategies for reasoning, which allows us to successfully and effectively apply our moral principles. Or they lead us to moral principles and they help us live by those moral principles.
I had something that is not on this list of questions, but something to bring up, and maybe you've got other points to make.
Sure.
I realized yesterday I found an instance of pride, as in I was speaking to someone and she was telling me about some books she was reading, and I would class them as self-improvement type books, and in order to make her better at relating to people and maybe better at work. I can't remember the specifics, but that's pride, right? Like self-improvement, the kind of person who reads self-improvement books, that's a form of pride, this, at least in the way that Rand defines it.
I would say so, that they're striving for betterment. They're striving for not more than just good enough. They're striving for their best self that there can be. I mean, ambitious in the sense you want to just be not only ambitious in what you want in life, but ambitious in your morality. You're ambitious to be perfection. Like, perfectionist is the wrong way to phrase it, but ambitious to be a moral paragon, a moral, upstanding person, like trying to be that. So yeah, I would say definitely. I mean, you could ask, are they using self-help as a way just to feel as if they're doing it because they're going through the motions? But that probably would, but it depends on the person. But as far as I know, most people I've known that are just in self-help to some extent are interested in becoming better themselves, and they are sensitive if somebody's being like just telling you floating platitudes versus something meaningful. I think most people do understand that. They don't take it as they really want to improve themselves.
Yeah, I've also experienced that too. I don't think I've experienced anyone who's, I mean, I've never met a person who's been reading for motions, and I wouldn't know how to tell. But most people I've met, it is really interesting now that I think about it a little more, that I've often in the past noticed that there are certain kinds of people I like, and those people often are into self-improvement. And that, I mean, that can vary, right? Self-improvement can be many things. It might be like someone who wants to get up on stage and perform because they, like I used to meet people at improvised drama, and they'd want to get up like to be more confident. And so they'd started performing. That's a form of self-improvement. And so is reading books on business and time management. And so is, what else would be an example? Someone who's like traveling in order to become more worldly. So I've been into those. Typically, I've noticed that in the people I like, that's one quality I've liked, and I've never had an abstract thing called a virtue and one called pride with which to describe it. I've always described it as people who are into self-improvement. So it is really interesting to then have this abstract to capture someone who's really cultivating, or I don't know if you say cultivating or has a virtue, because a virtue is something you do, but it's interesting to make this connection now. It helps identify what it is exactly that I've liked and noticed.
Personally, I like the word cultivate. I think that's useful because not only are you saying that you do these virtues, but you're always working towards some way to do them better. That you have them growing and they're there, but they keep growing and you keep helping them grow, which is what I think what cultivate usually implies. Like if you cultivate your garden, it's there, everything's growing, but then you just help it go even further than it has been.
I would say I like cultivate more for values too, because you get to consume the fruits and the cacao beans. You can crush them up and make some chocolate, and they're growing all the time and producing more, and you're cultivating them. The cultivating aspect is the action aspect, is the virtue, and then the plants that you're cultivating are the values.
Yeah, in a sense, like especially because you can think of it that way, that when you're cultivating plants, there's a lot of steps involved to make sure it goes right and goes well. Especially if you're, say, making chocolate, there's a lot to do with cacao beans to get them to grow properly, dry properly, have the right content and right soil and all that to make it grow properly. And of course, that's for plants, but and because they don't have minds, so that makes it much more simple. And people are just a next level of complexity, basically.
So it's interesting. I was also just thinking of, I think Aristotle said something like, "We are what we do," and so that makes sense that you could say someone is prideful, or in this case, maybe morally ambitious, because it's not like there's that final thing that they are. It's more that's what they're doing. So you can describe them that way. You say they are morally ambitious. That, using Aristotle's description of what we are, is what we do.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Can you think of any other examples as well? So like, I'm curious if you have more as well. So I've given reading self-improvement books, traveling to cultivate worldliness, doing improvised theater in order to build social confidence, reading business books in the morning in order to become, better at sales or work, productivity.
I'll take that. I'll build on that theater example. We'll say somebody wants to be an actor. They want to not just be a good actor, but they want to be a great actor. There's certain things they must do to get there, of course, to read a lot, or read a variety of literature to get a sense of what a character is, or maybe read some psychology books to get a sense of how people think. Learn techniques of memorizing lines, all those sort of things. But you can start to characterize that as pride because they want to be the best and they don't want to cheat to get there, that they're doing all the steps necessary to be the best at it. And when we really get into it, being the best actor that there had ever been, one of the greatest in the world, it would imply like taking all these other virtues into account and going by those, like looking yourself honestly, what are the skills that you don't have yet? What are the skills you're not very good with yet? Or acknowledging to yourself what you need to build on or what you haven't learned yet, or even acknowledging who you could learn from and understanding what you do know and what you don't know. And going from there, I mean, you could think it then once somebody attains like high quality actor status, and if they do it honestly, they should be able to attain all these wonderful things that that they're confident in their ability, that they're honest about their ability, they're honest about judging what it means to be an actor. It would just be part of that process of like once you get there, it's not just that, okay, you learn how to be a good actor and that's divorced from your morality, but it actually quite is connected to your moral ability, that you can't just become great at acting because you did some steps right. You gotta, there's morality involved in there too. And well, even attaining anything in life, you have to attain these, go by these moral standards.
Yeah, I suppose no one, when we speak like that, no one, when I'm thinking about it, no one would speak or think in those terms. I've never met anyone who would think, I think most people, including myself, I didn't really even know what pride was, to be honest, wouldn't make any connection between morality and self-improvement, nor would they make a connection between pride and self-improvement. So these definitions are like way out there in terms of at least what I and people I know would connect to.
Are there any famous people you can think of that like are at the top of their craft that you would admire on a moral level or respect it to a high degree?
When you say admire on a moral level, though, do you mean outside the context of their work?
Or just say that you really look up to them and you like them not just for the work they do, but you like them as a person. I'll put it that way for now.
Maybe a friend. I've got a good, no famous. I don't really follow famous
Okay.
people. Like, I mean, there are authors that I'm like, wow, this work's amazing. I don't know the author personally.
Yeah.
And then there's maybe, like a friend who I think has done amazing work, and at the same time, I value him as a person, like outside the context of his work.
I mean, you
But
could think of perfection just in terms of that. If well, I was only saying famous person because that way it'd be somebody we both know of, at least get a sense of. Or if there's, I guess I'll give a personal example of like a famous person. Like I really appreciate Malcolm X as a person, morally speaking, and he can be controversial at times when some of his beliefs and not on people always don't always understand what his beliefs are. But like he had been a person to me that I would think is very prideful in the Randian sense because he had gone to jail and done like petty crimes, stealing and things like that. And he was kind of just mad at the world in a way, just did crime because it was right. He did what felt right, kind of hedonistic about it, and he went to jail. And he kind of redeemed himself, like he acknowledged his wrongdoing in the past, that he had the wrong way of thinking, that he was being impulsive and irrational, that he wasn't thinking things through. He converted to Islam, so we could still argue what's the value of religion as far as morality, but he started acknowledging how to think better, be better, live better. And he changed himself at that point. He read lots of books. He took the time to study and think and be thorough about his thinking. And really he changed as a person completely based on that extent that he started thinking, opening his mind, and he more than just started sharing ideas or thinking the right thing. He took action with regard to it. He took action against explicitly racist policies in this area and going about it in a way that's basically nonviolent, but not anti-force, like against initiation of force, essentially. And he really fought against that to the best he could. And even further beyond that, was he even grew wiser. He took himself away from that specific Muslim organization he had. So he was still acknowledging and growing, acknowledging what had been irrational in his life or against life, and he kept seeking more and more. And he was so ambitious to the extent that like, nothing short of moral perfection would be good enough for him. He wants the best and is the best and trying to be the best, but unfortunately he was assassinated to the degree that he was actually starting to diverge too much from the particular church he was part of. So they assassinated him. But I think he's an example of pride in the Randian sense. Generally, you could say his flaws about exactly what his ethics are and what they should be, but he's living by a standard we can recognize as important to living life, that any mistakes he has made, he acknowledged them and fixed them as he grew. And it made his life better, but also difficult. But it's that kind of process of not just as an activist, he had particular beliefs, but along with it came moral perfection and moral virtue. At least he saw it, and that's the sort of thing you can think of as perfection and ambitiousness and pride. That somebody who achieves the pinnacle, and when you see how they've done it, you can. I think anybody you find heroic, if you look at their life, you can see the different things that they've done that led them there and allowed them to be this morally perfect person. And it was as much a part of their career as much as, say, going to school or getting training in this field or getting this one job. It's just as important.
Yeah, I don't know. I said I'd read Malcolm X, but I don't know much about him. But yeah. So you're saying it's
sorry, go ahead.
At the near the end of you discussing Malcolm X, you mentioned like it's almost like a school. Did you say as like going to university, or is it moral ambition?
I mean, your career and success in life is more than school or the degree you have. I mean, yes, that's important, but moral virtue is critical too. It's not just a nice thing to have that makes you nice or people like you, but is actually part of your success to be morally good and ambitious.
Yeah, I've got it's funny because it just reminded me, I was listening to an interview with a guy called Thomas Kaplan, and Thomas Kaplan is he's a mining he's made his wealth off mining, but he's also very well read. He did a postgrad in history, and he's running all these organizations, and he's just doing so many things. And he said something in the interview like intelligence is a commodity, meaning when he's hiring people, he finds it very easy to hire and find very intelligent people. Like if he needs a geologist, it's easy to acquire one who's got a lot of intelligence. But something like character is gold. And so I think it gets at that same thing of the moral ambitiousness, the character of a person, which is something built over time. It's hard to find that.
Yes. It really is something built over time. That's what really distinguishes pride from the other virtues, and why I had been saying it's not just a one thing. This one involves a lot going into it at once. It's not just a thing you like, I'm acting pridefully. It's more like much more deeper and much more wider context.
Yeah, I mean, I like that connection to Malcolm X too, because I do think this language is alienating for most people. Like, if you say, oh, that person has pride and moral ambitiousness, that person is moral, like, those are very, yeah, they're just alien terms. Like, at least the people, like I said, the people I know and hang out with, like, they wouldn't, that it's so hard to connect to any of that. But, you know, when you've gone through an essay and there are different definitions here, it is a different thing.
Well, you could think of plenty of other people that might strike you as more interesting. Like, well, I know Elon Musk interests me a lot. I like reading about him. There's some things I think are prideful in the good sense. Or you could take historical figures, maybe certain revolutionary figures that you might think are admirable. Um, can't think of any offhand. I mean, some people like certain founding fathers and think they're heroic. Like some people like think Alexander Hamilton in particular is a very prideful individual in many of the right things, and some wrong, but it's a good general sense. Or sometimes star basketball. Well, maybe think Michael Jordan. Maybe there's, if you know anything about him, he's probably prideful in the good sense that he's ambitious about it. But he has some moral flaws, so he might not be some moral flaws that really bother me. But it really depends. It really depends, like what fields are really interesting to you. That you're bound to find somebody at the top of their game, top of their field, and you can find things that they've done that are admirable, wonderful, and you would characterize as morally good by objectivist standards. But like self-interested and about reason, about self-esteem, about productivity. There's many historical people. It's just, in a way, is find your favorite example and go from there. There could be things about Richard Feynman you find very prideful and heroic and admirable. I mean, some people might prefer scientists, others maybe musicians, artists. It really depends on, or Beethoven to some people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely like there are people that I admire, well, I admire their achievements and the things they're doing. I don't know the people too well. Like Elon Musk, I admire a lot about him, but I haven't read about him. I don't know much about his life, so I can't really comment.
Right.
But I mean, it's a cool exercise to do, right? Like read this essay, get a grip or a grasp of some of the abstract definitions she's given to these virtues and see if you can make connections between them and like actual people. So that's real cool.
Yeah, her writing is very much intended for that. And that's how Rand thinks, and that's always the best way to interpret her, I think, is just take real life examples. Like she intends to say things where you can provide and see examples. And if you can't come up with an example, either that means she's not explaining it right, or or you're wrong, or she's wrong, or something like that. Like somebody's wrong if you can't find an example. Either you're wrong or she's wrong, or you're both wrong.
Yeah. But yeah, it is cool actually because it definitely identifies something I've noticed, and at least in this definition, it identifies something I've noticed, and I have liked and connected with people who are uh, cultivating pride way more than people who are not. And the people who are not still are really good and nice. And it's not like I can say, oh, this is a bad person. I don't think in those terms, but like, oh, this is a really, this is a nice person. But the people who I'm like, wow, this person's cool. I want to hang out with them. I want to spend time with them. They've always been prideful, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I wanted to be sure to get to the next part because about choosing values that you quoted there is very connected, of course.
Which
So
looking.
part two, the second part you have there going.
The second passage.
Yeah, Objectivist Ethics, page 30. Man,
Okay.
man is born with an emotional mechanism, just as he is born with a cognitive mechanism. But at both are at birth, both are tabula rasa. And so it goes on about that. Your emotional mechanism is like an electronic computer. Uh, And the programming consists of the values his mind chooses. So in a way, it's saying that it is saying that your emotions are a result of the way you choose your values and seek out values. That you have those emotions because of the way you've evaluated different values as good or bad. Whether that's incorrect or not, your emotion is a reaction to how you've made those judgments, whatever those judgments might be. And that your emotions are some reaction or consequence of those ideas. And they could be on a subconscious level in the sense that you've automatized them and made them so habitual that you don't even think about them much anymore, that you just almost like reflexive. And these are emotions distinct from just like fight or flight response. I mean, that's a different kind of emotion that Rand might have not really tried to acknowledge, but those are quite different. But thinking more in terms of like if something makes you sad, something makes you happy, something makes you angry, those sort of things. Those sort of choices. So, but then this goes into man chooses his values by a conscious process of thought. So that's what we were talking about before, where you might have a sense of things, or an implicit sense of things, but Rand wants to be talking about making these conscious, explicit choices. So making these choices is important to our moral life. And she's contrasting that with the different ways of choosing values, which could be mere association or faith or authority, or just anything besides thinking. Let's see, but one thing you ask is you want concrete examples of going through those. I think we should do those last, but I think this one here I want to get to. Discuss surfing as a chosen value, or T as a subconscious association. Well, about surfing as a chosen value, what is there a particular reason you asked that one, or what's confusing you about that one?
Yeah, so I was reading that and I was trying to make connections between what was being said in that passage to my life. And so I'll give you an example. So surfing, a few months ago I said, all right, I'm gonna pick some things and write them down as values, just so when I'm setting time to do stuff, I know, okay, this is a higher priority than this, and so on. And one of the things I put down was surfing. Why did I put down surfing? Well, I wanted to do some kind of sport that was away from a computer and that was non-intellectual and involved me being outside in nature. And the reason I picked surfing is I remember enjoying it when I was really young, going to the beach. I was living in a different city, and I remember being taken to the beach and enjoying surfing. So the reason I brought up surfing as a chosen value, there's definitely a component of that that's chosen. Like, okay, I want to do a sport outside in nature, surfing. Why surfing? It's not but a part of that is not me. Like my parents would take me to the beach, and I happened to enjoy it when I was young. I don't know why. That's subconscious association. And
Right.
so the selection, yes, there's a part that's chosen. So the part is, okay, I think I should do a sport outside in nature for this and this reason. And then I'm selecting on the basis of something that's not really chosen. There's just all these subconscious associations. So I'm trying to untangle that thought process because, yes, I mean, part of that is conscious, but part isn't too. Part is subconscious association.
I think the difficult thing about that is, to an extent, that's about exploring values. And we can't just write off exploring values as irrelevant or irrational. Even you have to learn about something to know if you even like it, or to learn about what it provides to you, how it impacts your life. And to an extent, that's just exploration. And in a sense, I can connect that to emotion with, you might not feel the same passion as a professional surfer, at least initially, because at least if you're doing everything rationally and in a moral way, that you're going to be evaluating these things, and so it will take time to build up to some particular emotional reaction. But I would still characterize that as exploring.
Sorry, can you? I didn't quite follow. So what do you
I'll
do you
try to
mean by
rephrase it.
exploring as well, and what build up a reaction?
Well, you're saying surfing has a chosen value, and you're evaluating like in what way is it a value, and what extent is it a consciously chosen value. I would just say you've consciously decided to try it out, see how it goes, see what you can learn from it. I'm trying to make the connection with emotion. Are you more wondering whether it's right to choose a value like that, or how you know it's right to choose a value, or how do you know if it's on faith or by reason? Like, I don't know. I'm not sure what you're asking exactly.
No, so in this case, I haven't taken ethics into consideration. All I'm trying to
Okay.
make the connection is okay, this passage says man chooses his values by a conscious process of thought. So what I'm trying to figure out is this value like is it part chosen by a conscious process thought, or is it fully chosen by conscious process of thought? Because like I said, um, I just remember being taken to the beach and enjoying it as a child. I didn't choose to go surfing as a child on the basis of reasoning. I'm choosing now, but the reason I thought of it as something that I want to try is, yeah, because, I just had the subconscious associations or the memories of enjoying being on the beach when I was young. And so is the value, I guess the question is that value fully chosen by a conscious process of thought? Or am I thinking about that? I don't know. It's a kind of messy, when you get into these epistemological type questions, it gets really messy and confusing.
That one's quite difficult. I'm not even sure I can give you a really confident answer in that. So, but I can tell you my thinking on it. Um, that's not really something I thought out too much in the past. So I'll just tell you my thinking right now. So to some extent, you could say that value is subjective, that you're not really sure why you like it. It just feels good or feels fun, but that's not really a good basis. But there could be reasons you're curious to explore it, curious to look into it. Sure, you might have like it almost doesn't matter why you got interested in the first place. Just okay, you are now. Like, what are the ways you can look into it? Is it rational to pursue it? Should you hold it as a value? And you could explore that and figure that out. You might discover, well, actually, I don't like it that much. I thought I might like it because I had positive associations in the past, but turns out it doesn't really provide anything for me. Or you can think about it further and realize that there is or isn't something worthwhile in it, worth choosing in it. But at least if you're going to be acting in an ethical way, you're going to consider it and think about it. You're not doing it merely because it felt good as a kid. No, you're saying to yourself, well, it did feel good as a kid, but it might fulfill me. It might lead to somewhere psychologically positive. It might lead to like health-wise, better psychological health. It might help in different ways. And you're not going just by association. You're not merely saying I associate with good things, therefore I do it. You think about it further beyond that. You're not taking it on faith. You're not saying I like surfing. I just did it once, whatever. It doesn't matter. I know I'll like it, so I'll do it. Like that's not really good either. And you're not doing it just because somebody like you're good at surfing, so go do it, and then you do it. Like you're thinking further than just an impulse or a momentary thing. You're going further. That you don't want to hold it subjectively. That you're really trying to validate, go through it, think about it, and hold it in an objective sense, not just it felt right. So you can just go by from there. we can evaluate as a morally good choice, at least in the sense it's not harming you, it can benefit your life in some way, and it's generally good for you. Of course, there's difficult questions about maybe things that are more built in a sense, that seem to start much earlier. Say child prodigies who get really into a musician, a certain instrument. To what extent is that rational if they continue as they grow older? Or you might ask, well, even about certain preferences in food, or even debates about sexuality, something that comes into play. To what extent is their choice, or to what extent is it baked in there already? So that's where you get to really complicated questions. I would just start out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I formulated some thoughts now. So it is a fully conscious choice. There was a certain basis for the reasoning, and part of the basis, or part of what constituted that basis, was the experience I had when I was a child. It wasn't everything. It was part of what constituted the basis for me deciding to surf, or at least put it down as a value. And so you can't say it's not fully chosen, because if I were to say surfing isn't fully chosen because part of the basis for me reasoning myself into that, putting that down as a value, is my experience as a child, you can't say that, because if I said that, then anytime someone made any choice about anything, if there was if there was part of the reasoning was an experience they had, which maybe they didn't consciously reason themselves into. Like, for example, let's say you go to a restaurant with a friend and they introduce you to some food. You went to be with a friend and they introduce you to this amazing, um, um, amazing dish that you've never had before. Some kind of like, Western Chinese spice, and you're like, oh my God, what is this thing? And then you get super into this spice and you start learning about it and you're just fascinated by it. You may have, like, obviously you didn't consciously reason, all right, I'm going to go to a restaurant to eat a spice, therefore, and then get into the spice. So you had the experience and you really enjoyed it, and the experience was chance. But then later you thought about, actually, I do enjoy cooking. That's something that I want to do. You're consciously choosing cooking, but part of the basis for you making that decision is that experience. That experience was not your choice. But the reason I bring that up as an example is because, yeah, if I say, that's still fully consciously choosing. We don't control every single thing in our lives. We do control our decisions, but part of what our decisions are based on are things that come up, things we experience, things we see, and not all of them in our control. So anyway, that's my sort of answer to that now. It is a fully conscious chosen value, but yeah.
Yeah, but you just have to acknowledge also that sometimes people do just flow into those things by social osmosis and not really thinking it through, kind of going through in a haze and unfocused mind. Just distinguish that from the unfocused mind, choosing values in quotes. Like, kind of like, maybe it strikes you as pleasurable, therefore you choose and don't think about it further. That might be like social osmosis. Just, it felt right, so you did it, and you keep doing it because it's tradition. Like, that would be kind of blind or social osmosis. Like saying you go to church and do communion, not because you believe, but it's because, like, you value it because it's just, you just do it by osmosis. You're used to it, you're comfortable. You didn't think that much about it, but it works okay. And you do it anyway. Because you like just being around the people. I mean, there's something like that. It's not really thought through. It's kind of like hazy, like, well, they do it out of tradition, but what about then? In what sense did they really think it through beyond just they chose it? Like, you can say in this context it's more conscious in the sense of focused. Are you deliberate in your choice? Have you thought it through? Did you mean it? Like, it could be a little bit more precise. Her wording could have been a bit more precise about conscious process of thought, but she's definitely distinguishing focused versus unfocused.
Got it. I didn't understand. I got it. I didn't understand what you said. Like, actually, so one thing I didn't understand is, unless this is just a literary flourish type thing, like I don't see any essential difference between social osmosis and subconscious association. So it just seems like she wrote that as a, it's more like, when you write a few nice words at the end of a sentence, but there's no essential difference between those two based on the examples you
Oh
gave.
yeah, on those at the end, like except by default, subconscious association, social osmosis, those I generally think of as the same. Or they're synonyms, not identical, but when you're writing, it's good to just make explicit even different ways of phrasing the same thing.
Got it. Okay, cool. I mean, that clarifies a lot. All right. So we'll end this session recording.
Yep.